In the autumn of 1965, the Higgins family of four vanished without a trace from their cottage in the village of Ashworth, Yorkshire. Their disappearance would have remained just another unsolved case in the files of the local constabulary, if not for what investigators found 3 months later: a hidden room beneath St. Mary's Church, containing personal belongings of the Higgins family, along with detailed journal entries describing rituals that the Church of England had officially banned centuries ago. The strangest part: the final entry was dated 2 weeks after the family's reported disappearance. For nearly 60 years, the church has refused to comment on the discovery, and the cottage where the Higgins family lived remains abandoned to this day. What makes this case even more disturbing is that when investigators finally gained access to sealed church records in 1985, they discovered that the Higgins family was not the first to disappear under these mysterious circumstances. Tonight, I'll reveal what really happened in that quiet Yorkshire village, based on documents that have never been made public until now, including testimony from the only surviving witness who has finally agreed to break 40 years of silence. Before we continue with the story of the Higgins family and their connection to St. Mary's Church, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest mysteries that others won't tell. If you're one of those true mystery seekers, subscribe now and let me know in the comments what country you're listening from. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, stories that authorities tried to bury forever. Now let's step into the shadows of 1965 Yorkshire and discover what terror awaited in Ashworth village. What unfolded in that small Yorkshire community would challenge everything the residents believed about their quiet, God-fearing village, and reveal a conspiracy of silence that had protected unspeakable secrets for nearly half a century. Ashworth was the kind of village where time seemed to move differently, where the ancient stone walls held memories of 8 centuries of human habitation. Nestled deep in the Yorkshire Dales, surrounded by rolling hills that turned purple with heather each autumn, it was home to barely 300 souls, most of whom could trace their families back 5 or 6 generations in the same handful of cottages. The village centered around St. Mary's Church, a magnificent Norman structure that dominated the landscape, with its weathered limestone tower rising nearly 100 feet into the Yorkshire sky. The church had been built in 1187 on the site of an even older Saxon chapel, and local folklore claimed that the location had been considered sacred long before Christianity arrived in the Dales. The massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands that had turned black with age, creaked ominously in the wind that constantly swept down from the moors. The autumn of 1965 brought an unusual chill to Yorkshire that seemed to settle into the very bones of the village. The leaves turned earlier than anyone could remember, painting the hillsides in deep crimsons and golds that appeared almost unnatural in their intensity. A persistent fog had begun settling over the valley each evening around sunset, clinging to the ancient stones of St. Mary's like a living thing. The fog was so thick that many residents reported feeling disoriented when walking through the churchyard at dusk, as if the familiar paths had somehow shifted in the mist. The church bells, which had rung punctually for hundreds of years to mark the hours and call the faithful to worship, began to sound different that autumn. Mrs. Agnes Pemberton, who had lived next to the church for 63 years, noticed it first. The bronze bells seemed to produce a deeper, more resonant tone than she remembered, as if the very air had thickened around them. Sometimes, late at night, she would swear she heard the bells ringing when they shouldn't be. Soft, mournful peals that seemed to come from underground rather than the tower above. Thomas Arthur Higgins was a man whose life ran like clockwork. At 38 years old, he had inherited both his methodical nature and his position at the village post office from his father, who had inherited them from his father before him. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, Thomas would emerge from his cottage on Church Lane, dressed in his carefully pressed suit and carrying his worn leather satchel. He would walk his two children, Margaret Rose, age 12, and young William Thomas, age 8, to the village school before continuing to his work, sorting mail and managing telegrams for the entire valley. Thomas was a quiet man who kept his thoughts to himself, but those who knew him well described him as deeply religious in the traditional Yorkshire way, devout but not demonstrative, faithful but practical. He served as a church warden at St. Mary's and could be found every Sunday morning ensuring that the hymnals were properly arranged and the collection plates were clean. His faith was as steady and reliable as the Yorkshire hills themselves, which made what happened to him even more incomprehensible to those who knew him. Eleanor Mary Higgins, née Whitlock, had come to Ashworth as a young bride 15 years earlier. At 35, she retained the striking beauty that had first caught Thomas's attention at a church social in nearby Hawes. Her dark hair, which she wore in a practical style befitting a village mother, still caught the light in a way that made her appear younger than her years. Eleanor managed their small cottage with the same methodical precision that characterized the entire Higgins family. But there was something more restless about her nature, a curiosity about the world that sometimes put her at odds with the conservative traditions of village life. Eleanor had always been interested in local history and folklore, spending hours in the village library reading about the ancient customs of the Yorkshire Dales. She kept a garden filled with herbs and wildflowers that many of the older villagers recognized as plants their grandmothers had grown for purposes that were no longer discussed in polite company. When questioned about her unusual botanical interests, Eleanor would smile and mention that she enjoyed keeping the old traditions alive, though she was never specific about which traditions she meant. The Higgins children were the pride of the village school. Margaret Rose was a serious, thoughtful girl who excelled in her studies and helped her mother with household duties without complaint. She had inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's steady temperament, though teachers noticed that she sometimes seemed older than her 12 years, as if she carried knowledge that weighed heavily on her young shoulders. Margaret loved to read, particularly books about history and mythology, and she could often be found in the churchyard copying inscriptions from the oldest headstones into a notebook she carried everywhere. William Thomas, known to everyone as Billy, was the village's acknowledged charmer. At 8 years old, he possessed an infectious laugh and a curiosity about everything around him that endeared him to every adult in Ashworth. He was particularly fascinated by the church, spending hours examining the carved stone gargoyles that decorated the exterior walls and asking endless questions about the meaning of the stained glass windows. Billy had a habit of drawing constantly, filling notebook after notebook with sketches of the church, the surrounding countryside, and increasingly, as autumn progressed, disturbing images that his teacher found difficult to interpret. The village of Ashworth operated according to rhythms that had been established centuries earlier. Market day was still held every Thursday in the small square beside the church, though the merchants now arrived by motorcar rather than horse and cart. The pub, the Shepherd's Rest, served as the unofficial town hall where news was shared and opinions were formed. The post office doubled as a general store, and the village school taught children from 5 to 14 before they were sent to the larger town of Hawes for their final education. But beneath this veneer of rural tranquility, Ashworth harbored secrets that went back generations. The village had always been isolated, not just geographically but culturally. The old families, the Whitlocks, the Carrs, the Thorntons, and a handful of others, maintained traditions and observances that outsiders rarely glimpsed. These families intermarried regularly and shared knowledge that was passed down through carefully chosen bloodlines. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian and unofficial keeper of local law, was a descendant of one of Ashworth's founding families. Her cottage contained books and manuscripts that had been collected over centuries, including texts that the church had tried to suppress during various periods of religious reform. Mrs. Thornton was a small, bird-like woman in her 70s who spoke in whispers and seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to what she called preserving our heritage. Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician, was another member of the old families. At 55, he had returned to Ashworth after studying medicine in Edinburgh, bringing with him modern medical knowledge that he somehow managed to blend with older healing traditions that his grandmother had taught him. Dr. Carr maintained detailed records not just of his patients' physical health, but of what he called their spiritual well-being, though he was always vague about what exactly this meant. The local constable, Sergeant Robert Henley, was one of the few authority figures in Ashworth who was not connected to the old families. He had been assigned to the village 5 years earlier and had gradually become aware that there were aspects of village life that remained hidden from him. Henley was a thorough, methodical man who took pride in understanding his territory completely, and his inability to penetrate certain aspects of Ashworth's social structure had become a source of increasing frustration. Reverend Harold Whitmore had served St. Mary's for 23 years, arriving in Ashworth as a young curate fresh from theological college. Over the decades, he had transformed from an energetic advocate of church reform into something much more complex and troubling. His study, located in the rectory beside the church, was filled with ancient manuscripts, archaeological artifacts, and books on subjects that seemed to have little connection to conventional Anglican theology. Reverend Whitmore was a tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His sermons had grown increasingly esoteric over the years, filled with references to older truths and deeper mysteries that left many parishioners confused and unsettled. Yet he remained popular among certain members of the congregation, particularly those from the old families who seemed to understand references that escaped everyone else. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, several residents of Ashworth noticed changes in the Higgins family's behavior. The alterations were subtle at first, Eleanor spending more time in the churchyard, Thomas appearing distracted and worried, the children becoming more withdrawn. But as October progressed, these changes became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Agnes Pemberton, whose cottage shared a garden wall with the Higgins property, was the first to notice Eleanor's nocturnal activities. Beginning in early October, Eleanor had taken to spending long hours in St. Mary's churchyard after dark, often carrying what appeared to be bundles of herbs, flowers, and other items that Mrs. Pemberton couldn't identify in the moonlight. When she worked up the courage to ask Eleanor about these midnight excursions, the younger woman simply smiled and replied, "I'm tending to old traditions, Mrs. Pemberton. Someone has to keep the proper observances." The phrase "proper observances" meant nothing to Mrs. Pemberton, but it left her with a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Eleanor's tone had been pleasant enough, but there was something in her eyes that suggested depths of knowledge that made the older woman uncomfortable. Mrs. Pemberton began keeping her curtains drawn after dark and found excuses to avoid conversations with her neighbour. Mr. Arthur Finch, who owned the village's general store, noticed significant changes in Eleanor's purchasing habits during October. She had always been a careful shopper, buying only what her family needed and maintaining strict household accounts. But suddenly she was purchasing large quantities of unusual items, pounds of coarse salt, dozens of white candles, and what she described as specific herbs from old Mrs. Weatherby, the village's unofficial herbalist who grew medicinal and culinary plants in her extensive cottage garden. When Mr. Finch commented on these unusual purchases, Eleanor explained that she was preparing for the harvest season, though this explanation made little sense given that the Higgins family had never maintained more than a small kitchen garden. The items she was buying seemed more suited to some kind of ceremonial purpose than any practical household use, but Mr. Finch was too polite to pursue the matter further. The village school teacher, Miss Sarah Collins, became increasingly concerned about the behavior of the Higgins children during October. Margaret, who had always been an excellent student, became distracted and withdrawn. She was often caught staring out the classroom window towards St. Mary's Church, and when called upon to answer questions, she would respond as if awakening from a dream. Her essays, once models of clear thinking and proper grammar, became filled with references to ancient wisdom and forgotten truths that seemed far too sophisticated for a 12-year-old. Young Billy's behavior was even more alarming. The normally cheerful and talkative boy had become obsessed with drawing, spending every free moment creating the same disturbing image over and over again. The drawing showed robed figures standing around what appeared to be an altar, with symbols that Miss Collins didn't recognize but that somehow made her profoundly uncomfortable. When she asked Billy to explain his artwork, he would only say that he was drawing what Mummy and Mr. Whitmore taught me about the old church. Miss Collins attempted to discuss her concerns with Thomas during a parent conference in mid-October, but found him evasive and clearly distressed. Thomas admitted that Eleanor had become involved in what he called historical research with Reverend Whitmore and several other village residents, but insisted that it was just academic study. However, his manner suggested that he was far from comfortable with whatever was happening in his household. The organization that would eventually be revealed as the center of Ashworth's dark secrets had begun innocuously enough in 1962. Reverend Whitmore had proposed forming a group to study the historical traditions of the Yorkshire Dales, with particular emphasis on the pre-Christian customs that had shaped local culture for centuries before the arrival of Christianity. The group initially consisted of 5 members: Reverend Whitmore himself, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, Dr. Edmund Carr, Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, the herbalist, and Mr. James Crawford, a retired schoolmaster who had moved to Ashworth from London. The group met monthly in the church vestry, ostensibly to discuss historical documents and archaeological evidence relating to ancient Yorkshire traditions. They called themselves the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society and claimed to be working on a comprehensive study of local folklore that would eventually be published as a book for the benefit of future generations. Eleanor Higgins joined the group in the spring of 1964, drawn by her long-standing interest in local history and encouraged by Reverend Whitmore, who had noticed her extensive reading on folklore and traditional customs. Eleanor proved to be an enthusiastic and dedicated member, contributing research on herbal medicine and seasonal celebrations that impressed the other participants with its depth and authenticity. What the public didn't know was that the Historical Preservation Society's activities had gradually evolved far beyond academic research. By 1963, the group had begun what they called practical demonstrations of ancient rituals, initially justifying these activities as necessary for understanding the historical contexts they were studying. These demonstrations started simply enough: seasonal celebrations based on agricultural cycles, herbal preparation techniques that had been used for centuries, and meditation practices that they claimed were derived from Celtic spiritual traditions. However, under Reverend Whitmore's guidance, these practices had grown increasingly complex and disturbing. The vicar had convinced the group that true understanding of ancient traditions required not just intellectual study, but experiential participation. He argued that the early church had suppressed valuable spiritual knowledge, and that recovering these traditions was not only academically important, but spiritually necessary. By the time Eleanor joined, the group was meeting twice monthly, with additional special observances scheduled around what they called significant dates in the ancient calendar. These observances took place in a room beneath St. Mary's Church that Reverend Whitmore claimed to have discovered during renovation work. The room, he explained, had been used for religious purposes long before the current church was built, and represented a direct connection to the spiritual practices of their ancestors. Eleanor's enthusiasm for the group's work impressed all the members, but it was her suggestion that families should participate together in certain rituals that marked a turning point in the organization's development. She argued that many ancient traditions were specifically designed around family units, and that incomplete participation might actually be dangerous, potentially leaving rituals unfinished in ways that could have negative consequences. Thomas Higgins had initially been skeptical of his wife's involvement with the Historical Preservation Society, but Eleanor's obvious happiness and intellectual stimulation had gradually won him over. She would return from meetings filled with excitement about new discoveries and insights, sharing stories about Yorkshire's hidden history that fascinated even Thomas's practical mind. When Eleanor suggested that he might enjoy attending some of the group's presentations, Thomas agreed to visit one of their regular meetings. The meeting Thomas attended in June 1964 seemed harmless enough. Reverend Whitmore had prepared a lecture about medieval agricultural practices, complete with historical documents and artifacts that he had borrowed from various local collections. The other members were clearly knowledgeable and passionate about their research, and Thomas found himself genuinely interested in learning about the farming techniques that his own ancestors might have used centuries earlier. However, as months passed and Eleanor became increasingly involved with the group's activities, Thomas began to notice troubling changes in his wife's behavior and attitudes. She started speaking critically of modern religious practices, suggesting that contemporary Christianity had lost essential spiritual knowledge that ancient traditions preserved. She began keeping unusual schedules, staying up late to read obscure texts that Reverend Whitmore had given her, and waking before dawn to tend to plants and preparations that seemed to have no practical purpose. Most disturbing to Thomas was Eleanor's growing insistence that the children should be educated about the old ways. She began teaching Margaret and Billy about herbal medicine, seasonal celebrations, and what she called proper respect for the forces that shape our world. The children seemed to enjoy these lessons initially, but Thomas noticed that they were becoming secretive about what they learned, sharing private jokes and references that he didn't understand. In September 1965, Thomas decided to speak directly with Reverend Whitmore about his concerns. He arranged a private meeting in the vicar's study, intending to discuss Eleanor's growing obsession with the historical group and its effect on their family life. What he discovered during that conversation would haunt him for the few remaining weeks of his life. Reverend Whitmore received Thomas in his study, a room that had always seemed cluttered with books and papers, but now appeared almost overwhelming in its density of strange artifacts and unfamiliar texts. The vicar listened patiently as Thomas explained his worries, nodding sympathetically and asking thoughtful questions about specific examples of Eleanor's changed behavior. But when Thomas finished speaking, Reverend Whitmore's response was not what he had expected. Instead of offering reassurance or suggesting ways to moderate Eleanor's involvement with the group, the vicar launched into an explanation of why the family's participation in the Historical Society's work was not just beneficial but essential. He spoke about spiritual obligations that transcended individual preferences, about ancient responsibilities that certain families were chosen to fulfill, and about the dangerous consequences of abandoning traditions that had protected the community for generations. Thomas left that meeting more confused and concerned than ever. Reverend Whitmore's words had carried an undercurrent of threat that Thomas couldn't quite identify, but definitely felt. The vicar had made it clear that the Higgins family's continued participation in the group's activities was not merely desired, but required, though he had never explicitly stated what might happen if they chose to withdraw. October 1965 brought an acceleration of strange events in Ashworth that seemed to center around the Higgins family. Eleanor's activities became more intensive and secretive, with multiple trips to the church each week and constant preparation of materials whose purpose she would not explain to her increasingly worried husband. The children's behavior became more erratic, with both Margaret and Billy displaying knowledge and using vocabulary that seemed far beyond their years. Dr. Edmund Carr would later testify that Thomas visited his office 3 times during October, displaying symptoms of severe anxiety and what the physician described as acute nervous exhaustion. Thomas complained of insomnia, loss of appetite, and what he called a feeling of impending doom that he couldn't shake. When Dr. Carr pressed him for details about the source of his distress, Thomas would only say that Eleanor had become involved in activities that he feared were dangerous for the whole family. During his final visit to Dr. Carr's office on October 25th, Thomas appeared to be on the verge of a complete breakdown. He spoke rapidly and incoherently about ancient obligations and ceremonies that can't be stopped once they begin. He asked Dr. Carr about the symptoms of what he called religious mania, and whether there were medical treatments for people who had become convinced they were receiving supernatural communications. Most disturbing, Thomas asked Dr. Carr whether he believed it was possible for old evil to persist in places where terrible things had happened in the past. When the doctor asked what had prompted this question, Thomas replied that Eleanor had been spending time in parts of the church that he was certain had never been open to the public before, and that she claimed to be receiving guidance from sources that existed beyond the ordinary world. Dr. Carr recommended that Thomas speak with Reverend Whitmore about his spiritual concerns, advice that he would spend the rest of his life regretting. What Dr. Carr didn't know was that the vicar was not a source of help for the Higgins family, but the primary architect of their doom. The final week of October brought dramatic changes to the Higgins household that were noticed by everyone who knew the family. Eleanor stopped attending her usual social obligations and was rarely seen outside her cottage except for trips to the church. The children stopped playing with their friends and appeared increasingly pale and withdrawn. Thomas missed several days of work, something that had never happened in his 15 years at the post office. Mrs. Pemberton later recalled hearing sounds from the Higgins cottage that she couldn't identify: rhythmic chanting, the burning of substances that produced unusually acrid smoke, and conversations conducted in voices so low that she couldn't make out words, but could detect emotional intensity that made her increasingly uncomfortable. On several occasions, she observed unusual visitors arriving at the Higgins cottage after dark. Figures in dark clothing who moved with purposeful silence and never stayed longer than an hour. October 31st, 1965, was a Sunday that dawned grey and cold, with the persistent fog that had plagued Ashworth all autumn hanging so low that the top of St. Mary's Tower was completely obscured. The morning service proceeded normally, with the Higgins family occupying their customary pew in the third row. However, several parishioners later recalled that the family's behavior during the service had been distinctly unusual. Eleanor sat with an expression of intense concentration throughout Reverend Whitmore's sermon, which focused on the theme of ancient covenants and their persistence through time. She appeared to be taking notes in a small leather journal, something she had never done during church services before. Thomas sat rigidly beside her, his face pale and his hands clenched in his lap. The children were unusually quiet, sitting perfectly still in a way that seemed unnatural for youngsters their age. Reverend Whitmore's sermon itself was unlike his usual presentations. He spoke about obligations that transcend individual choice and the wisdom of traditions that predate our current understanding. He made several references to tonight's observance and the importance of completing what has been begun. Phrases that meant nothing to most of the congregation, but clearly had special significance for certain members. After the service, the Higgins family was seen walking home together, but their movement seemed somehow different from their usual Sunday routine. Instead of the leisurely pace they typically maintained, they walked quickly and purposefully, as if they had urgent business awaiting them. Mrs. Pemberton, who was tending her garden when they passed, later recalled that none of them acknowledged her greeting, something that was completely out of character for the normally polite family. The last confirmed sighting of the complete Higgins family was at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, when Mr. Finch observed them entering their cottage and closing the door firmly behind them. What happened next would only be pieced together months later from evidence found in the hidden chambers beneath St. Mary's Church. Mrs. Pemberton noticed that the lights in the Higgins cottage were extinguished earlier than usual that evening. By 8 o'clock, the house was completely dark, something that had never happened before on a Sunday night, when the family traditionally spent the evening reading and preparing for the week ahead. When she peered through her curtains at 10 o'clock, she could see no signs of life in the cottage at all. But it was sometime after midnight on October 31st that Mrs. Pemberton witnessed the event that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was awakened by sounds that she initially thought were part of a dream. Distant chanting that seemed to rise and fall with a rhythm that was both hypnotic and deeply disturbing. When she realized that the sounds were real, She moved to her bedroom window to investigate their source. What she saw in St. Mary's churchyard defied rational explanation. Figures carrying candles or torches were moving in what appeared to be a procession around the church building. The figures were dressed in dark robes that obscured their identities, but their movements were purposeful and coordinated, suggesting a ceremony that had been carefully planned and rehearsed. The chanting continued for what seemed like hours, rising and falling in intensity, but never stopping completely. Mrs. Pemberton was certain that she could hear children's voices among the adult ones, high and clear notes that stood out against the deeper tones of the adult participants. The sound made her feel physically ill, though she couldn't explain why. Most disturbing of all, the procession eventually disappeared. Mrs. Pemberton watched as the figures moved toward the church building and simply vanished, as if the ancient stone walls had opened to receive them. The lights continued to flicker in the churchyard for several more hours, but she never saw the participants emerge. Monday morning, November 1st, 1965, began what would become one of the most perplexing missing persons investigations in Yorkshire history. When Thomas failed to appear at the post office by his usual time of 8:15 a.m., his supervisor, Mr. Gregory Walsh, initially assumed that the family was dealing with illness or some other temporary emergency. However, when repeated telephone calls to the Higgins cottage went unanswered, Mr. Walsh decided to investigate personally. He walked to Church Lane and knocked on the cottage door, receiving no response. When he peered through the windows, he could see that the interior appeared neat and undisturbed, but there were no signs of current occupation. The cottage felt empty in a way that suggested the absence was not temporary. Mr. Walsh contacted Sergeant Robert Henley, who arrived at the cottage within 30 minutes to begin a preliminary investigation. What Henley found would puzzle him for months and eventually lead to discoveries that would shake the entire community of Ashworth to its foundation. The cottage door was unlocked, something that was unusual but not unprecedented in a village where most residents trusted their neighbors completely. The interior was immaculately clean and organized, with no signs of struggle, hasty departure, or foul play. The family's personal belongings were in their expected places. Eleanor's purse hanging on its usual hook, Thomas's wallet in the dresser drawer where he always kept it, the children's school clothes laid out for Monday morning. In the kitchen, Henley found evidence that the family had prepared and eaten Sunday dinner. The dishes had been washed and put away, and there were no signs that a meal had been interrupted or abandoned. However, he did notice that certain items seemed to be missing from their usual locations. Candles that Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned seeing in the cottage, several books from Eleanor's collection of folklore texts, and what appeared to be some of the herbal preparations that she had been working on in recent weeks. Most puzzling was the discovery in Thomas's small study. On his desk lay an open Bible turned to the book of Revelation, chapter 20, which deals with the binding of Satan and the judgment of the dead. Written in the margin, in what appeared to be Eleanor's handwriting, was a single line: "The old covenant must be honored at all costs." Below it, in Thomas's more angular script, were the words, "God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back." Sergeant Henley spent the entire day conducting interviews with every resident of Ashworth who might have information about the family's disappearance. The picture that emerged from these conversations was troubling and contradictory. While everyone agreed that the Higgins family had been acting strangely in recent weeks, no one could provide specific information about where they might have gone or why they would have left without telling anyone. Henley's investigation quickly revealed that several key members of the community were being less than forthright about their knowledge of the family's activities. Reverend Whitmore, when questioned about the Historical Preservation Society, acknowledged that Eleanor had been an active member, but insisted that the group's activities were purely academic and couldn't possibly be connected to the disappearance. However, when Henley pressed for details about the group's recent meetings and activities, the vicar became evasive and defensive. Whitmore claimed that the society's records were confidential and that revealing the content of their discussions would violate the trust of other members. He suggested that the family had probably decided to take an impromptu vacation and would likely return within a few days. Dr. Carr was even less helpful, claiming that patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing his recent conversations with Thomas. When Henley pointed out that missing persons investigations took precedence over normal confidentiality requirements, Dr. Carr reluctantly admitted that Thomas had been suffering from anxiety related to family pressures, but refused to elaborate on the specific nature of these pressures. Mrs. Thornton, the librarian, proved to be the most forthcoming of the Historical Preservation Society members, though her information was more disturbing than helpful. She acknowledged that the group had been researching ancient religious practices and that some members had become perhaps too enthusiastic about implementing their discoveries. When pressed for details, she mentioned that recent meetings had focused on what she called seasonal observances that were traditional in this area centuries ago. The breakthrough in Henley's investigation came from an unexpected source. Miss Sarah Collins, the school teacher, approached him 3 days after the disappearance with a collection of drawings that Billy Higgins had created during October. The drawings depicted robed figures gathered around what appeared to be an underground altar, with symbols and arrangements that seemed far too sophisticated for an 8-year-old child to have invented. Miss Collins also provided Henley with essays that Margaret had written in the weeks before the disappearance. The essays dealt with topics such as the wisdom of ancient traditions and why modern people have forgotten important truths. The writing was technically excellent, but contained ideas and references that seemed to come from adult sources rather than a 12-year-old's imagination. Armed with evidence that the Historical Preservation Society was involved in activities far more serious than academic research, Sergeant Henley decided to search St. Mary's Church more thoroughly than his initial cursory investigation had allowed. What he discovered would transform the missing persons case into something far more sinister. Henley's attention was first drawn to discrepancies in the church's architecture that he had noticed during his initial search, but hadn't considered significant. Certain walls seemed thicker than necessary, and there were spaces in the building's layout that didn't correspond to any visible rooms. When he measured the interior dimensions against the exterior walls, he found gaps that suggested the existence of hidden spaces. His suspicions were confirmed when he discovered loose stones in the wall behind the altar. The stones had been carefully fitted to blend seamlessly with the surrounding masonry, but close examination revealed that they could be removed to reveal a passage leading downward into darkness. The passage was narrow and steep, carved directly into the living rock beneath the church foundation. The hidden chamber that Henley found at the bottom of the passage was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his 15 years of police work. The space was roughly circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with walls covered in symbols that appeared to be a mixture of Christian imagery and much older pagan markings. The floor was made of the same ancient stone as the church above, but arranged in a complex pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward a central altar. The altar itself was a massive block of black stone that clearly predated the Norman church by centuries. Its surface was stained with substances that Henley preferred not to identify, and it was surrounded by candles, dried herbs, and other materials that suggested recent use. The air in the chamber was thick with the lingering scent of incense and something else, a metallic odor that made Henley's stomach turn. But it was the personal belongings scattered around the chamber that confirmed Henley's worst fears about the fate of the Higgins family. Eleanor's wedding ring lay on the altar, along with Thomas's pocket watch, Margaret's school ribbon, and Billy's favorite toy soldier. The items were arranged carefully, as if they were offerings rather than simply discarded possessions. More disturbing than these personal effects were the documents that Henley found throughout the chamber. Handwritten journals, some dating back decades, described rituals and ceremonies that had been conducted in the underground space by successive generations of Ashworth residents. The most recent entries were in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting and revealed the true nature of the Historical Preservation Society's activities. Eleanor's journal entries, dating from her first involvement with the Historical Preservation Society in 1964 through the final entry on October 30, 1965, provided a detailed account of how academic research had gradually transformed into something far more dangerous and obsessive. The early entries showed genuine intellectual curiosity about local traditions and folklore, but as months passed, the tone became increasingly reverential toward what Eleanor called the old wisdom and the true faith. By the spring of 1965, Eleanor's journal entries revealed that the Historical Preservation Society had moved far beyond theoretical research into what they called practical restoration of ancient religious practices. The group had convinced itself that modern Christianity had corrupted essential spiritual truths and that recovering older traditions was not just academically interesting, but spiritually necessary for the community's well-being. Eleanor wrote extensively about rituals that the group had begun performing in the hidden chamber, starting with simple seasonal celebrations and gradually progressing to more complex ceremonies that she claimed had been practiced in the Yorkshire Dales for thousands of years before Christianity arrived. She described these rituals in loving detail, emphasizing their beauty and spiritual power, while glossing over aspects that might have concerned a more objective observer. The most disturbing entries dealt with what Eleanor called the harvest ceremony, a ritual that she claimed was essential for maintaining the spiritual protection of the community. According to her research, this ceremony required the participation of a complete family unit and could only be performed on specific dates when the barriers between worlds were thinnest. Eleanor's final entries revealed that she had convinced herself that her family had been chosen for a special role in preserving ancient traditions. She wrote about signs and portents that had appeared in recent weeks, suggesting that the time had come for the Higgins family to fulfill their spiritual obligations. The tone of these entries was ecstatic and filled with religious fervor that bordered on mania. But it was the discovery of a second journal, hidden beneath loose stones in the chamber floor, that provided the most shocking revelations about what had really happened to the Higgins family and countless others before them. The hidden journal was bound in cracked leather and appeared to be much older than Eleanor's records. The handwriting belonged to multiple authors spanning several decades, with entries dating back to the 1920s. What Sergeant Henley found in these pages would reveal that the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society was not a recent aberration, but part of a conspiracy that had been operating for nearly 50 years. The earliest entries were written by Reverend Whitmore's predecessor, Father Michael Blackwood, who had served St. Mary's from 1919 until his mysterious death in 1942. Father Blackwood's initial entries described his discovery of the underground chamber during renovation work and his fascination with the ancient symbols and artifacts he found there. Like Whitmore after him, Blackwood had been an educated man with interests in archaeology and local history. However, Father Blackwood's journal revealed a gradual descent into obsession and ultimately something far darker than academic research. By the mid-1920s, he was writing about communications he believed he was receiving through meditation in the underground chamber. These communications allegedly provided instructions for rituals that would ensure the community's prosperity and protection from outside threats. The journal contained detailed descriptions of ceremonies that Father Blackwood claimed were based on authentic ancient traditions, but which were clearly his own inventions. Influenced by his reading of occult literature and his growing psychological instability, the rituals became increasingly elaborate and demanding, requiring specific participants chosen according to criteria that seemed to change based on Father Blackwood's personal whims and paranoid delusions. By 1928, the journal entries revealed that Father Blackwood had recruited a small group of followers who were willing to participate in his ceremonies. The group included many of the same family names that would later be involved in Reverend Whitmore's Historical Preservation Society: the Thorntons, the Carrs, the Weatherbys, and others. Father Blackwood had convinced these families that they were part of an ancient bloodline chosen to preserve sacred knowledge. The most horrifying entries described what Father Blackwood called the ultimate sacrifice, ceremonies that he claimed would ensure the community's protection, but which clearly involved the murder of entire families. The first such ceremony was conducted in October 1930 and involved the Morrison family, who had recently moved to Ashworth from Scotland. Father Blackwood's description of their deaths was clinical and matter-of-fact, as if he were recording a routine religious observance rather than multiple murders. Henley's analysis of the journal entries revealed a consistent pattern that had been followed for decades. Every few years, Father Blackwood and later Reverend Whitmore would select a family for what they called spiritual elevation. The selection process was based on criteria that seemed designed to target families who were either new to the community or socially isolated in ways that would make their disappearance less likely to attract outside attention. The Morrison family in 1930 had been followed by the Hartwell family in 1933, the Spencers in 1936, and the Dunbars in 1939. Each family's disappearance had been carefully orchestrated to appear voluntary. Their possessions would be quietly disposed of. Their cottage would be rented to new tenants, and anyone who asked questions would be told that the family had decided to emigrate or move to another part of the country. Father Blackwood's death in 1942 had temporarily interrupted the pattern, but Reverend Whitmore's arrival in 1943 had marked the beginning of a new phase. Whitmore's journal entries, which began appearing in the Hidden Record in 1945, showed that he had discovered Father Blackwood's work and initially been horrified by what he found. However, over the course of several months, Whitmore had convinced himself that his predecessor's actions had been spiritually justified. Whitmore's rationalization process was documented in painful detail. He wrote about prayer and meditation sessions in the underground chamber where he claimed to receive divine guidance about continuing Father Blackwood's work. He interpreted various coincidences and natural events as signs that the murders had indeed protected the community from disasters that would otherwise have befallen it. By 1947, Whitmore had resumed the pattern of ritualized murder, selecting the Fletcher family as his first victims. His journal entries showed that he had refined Father Blackwood's methods, developing more sophisticated techniques for psychological manipulation and community misdirection. Whitmore understood that the key to maintaining the conspiracy was ensuring that community members genuinely believed they were participating in beneficial spiritual practices rather than murder. The families who disappeared under Whitmore's leadership included the Ashfords in 1950, the Kellys in 1953, the Bradfords in 1956, the Hawkins in 1959, and the Pattersons in 1962. Each disappearance had been preceded by months of psychological preparation, with the selected family being gradually drawn into the Historical Preservation Society and convinced that they had been chosen for a special spiritual role. Whitmore's journal entries revealed sophisticated techniques for psychological manipulation that explained how he had been able to convince educated, rational people to participate in their own murders. The process began with recruitment into the Historical Preservation Society, which genuinely did conduct academic research into local traditions and folklore. This research provided a foundation of legitimacy that made the group's later claims seem plausible. New members would spend months or even years participating in harmless activities, lectures, research projects, and simple seasonal celebrations that were based on authentic historical practices. During this period, Whitmore would carefully assess each participant's psychological vulnerabilities and susceptibility to influence. Only those who showed the right combination of intellectual curiosity, spiritual seeking, and social isolation would be selected for deeper involvement. The transition from academic research to active participation in rituals was gradual and carefully managed. Whitmore would introduce increasingly esoteric concepts, always framing them in terms of historical authenticity and spiritual enlightenment. Members who expressed doubt or discomfort would be subtly excluded from further activities, while those who embraced the concepts would be invited to participate in more advanced practices. The underground chamber played a crucial role in the manipulation process. Whitmore had learned that the space's unusual acoustics, combined with the psychological effect of being in a hidden, ancient location, made participants more susceptible to suggestion and group pressure. The chamber was deliberately kept cold and dimly lit, conditions that research had shown could induce altered states of consciousness, even without the use of drugs or other substances. Whitmore also used what he called spiritual preparation, periods of fasting, meditation, and isolation that were designed to break down participants' critical thinking abilities and increase their dependence on the group for emotional and spiritual support. By the time a family was selected for the harvest ceremony, they had been so thoroughly conditioned that they genuinely believed they were participating in a sacred ritual that would benefit not just themselves, but the entire community. Eleanor Higgins's journal entries showed this process in action. Her transformation from curious researcher to fanatical believer had taken place over 18 months of careful manipulation. Whitmore had exploited her intellectual interests, her spiritual yearning, and her desire to feel special and chosen. By October 1965, Eleanor was so convinced of the rightness of her path that she had become an active advocate for her family's participation in the ceremony. The final entries in both Eleanor's journal and Whitmore's hidden record provided a detailed account of the events that had led to the Higgins family's murder. The ceremony had been planned for months, with elaborate preparations that included not just ritual elements, but practical considerations, such as how to dispose of the bodies and explain the family's disappearance to the community. Eleanor's final entry, dated October 30th, revealed her complete psychological surrender to Whitmore's manipulation. She wrote about her excitement at being chosen for spiritual elevation and her gratitude for the opportunity to serve the community in such a profound way. She expressed concern only about Thomas's reluctance to fully embrace the experience, but noted that Reverend Whitmore had assured her that Thomas's doubts would be resolved during the ceremony itself. Whitmore's account of October 31st was clinical and detailed, describing the logistics of the murder with the same methodical precision that characterized all his activities. The ceremony had begun at 11:00 p.m., with the Higgins family and 6 other members of the Historical Preservation Society gathering in the underground chamber. The other participants included Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Weatherby, Mr. Crawford, and 2 others whose names Henley recognized as respected members of the community. The ritual itself had been designed to gradually overcome any resistance from Thomas or the children. It began with familiar elements, chanting, candlelight, and herbal preparations that the family had experienced during previous meetings. However, as the ceremony progressed, these familiar elements were combined with psychological pressure and what Whitmore euphemistically called spiritual substances, drugs that had been added to wine that the participants consumed. Thomas's resistance had been anticipated and planned for. When he attempted to leave the chamber with his children, he found that the other participants were prepared to prevent his departure by force. The children, already disoriented by the drugs and the traumatic nature of the situation, had been unable to understand what was happening or effectively resist. Whitmore's account of the actual murders was brief and matter-of-fact. The family had been killed using methods that Whitmore claimed were based on ancient sacrificial practices, but which were simply efficient techniques for murder. The bodies had been disposed of in a complex system of natural caves that extended beneath the church, caves that had been used for the same purpose for decades. The journal entries revealed that the Higgins family's murder had been followed by a carefully orchestrated cover-up that involved most of the village's authority figures. Dr. Carr had prepared false medical records suggesting that the family had been suffering from a contagious illness that required them to leave the village immediately. Mrs. Thornton had spread rumors about Thomas receiving a job offer in another county that required immediate relocation. The family's personal belongings had been systematically disposed of, with valuable items being redistributed among members of the Historical Preservation Society and everything else being destroyed or buried. The cottage had been cleaned thoroughly to remove any evidence of the family's final days, and within a week of their disappearance, it had been rented to a new family who had been told that the previous tenants had emigrated to Canada. Sergeant Henley's investigation had been deliberately hampered by community members who provided false information or simply refused to cooperate. When Henley had asked specific questions about the Historical Preservation Society, he had been given misleading answers designed to make the group seem harmless and academic. Several witnesses had lied outright about their knowledge of the family's activities in the weeks before their disappearance. The conspiracy extended beyond the active participants in the murders to include community members who suspected the truth but chose to remain silent rather than confront the horror in their midst. The journal entries revealed that several villagers had privately expressed concerns about the pattern of disappearances over the years, but had been persuaded by social pressure and fear to keep their suspicions to themselves. Just when we thought we understood the full scope of the horror in Ashworth, Sergeant Henley's investigation was about to uncover evidence that would reveal an even more disturbing truth about the community's complicity in decades of murder. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when Henley finally confronted the living participants in this conspiracy of silence. Armed with overwhelming evidence from the journal entries and physical evidence found in the underground chamber, Sergeant Henley faced the difficult task of confronting a conspiracy that involved some of the most respected members of the Ashworth community. His investigation had revealed that at least 12 people had direct knowledge of the murders, with dozens more having various levels of complicity in the cover-ups that had protected the killers for decades. Henley's first arrest was Dr. Edmund Carr, whose medical records and journal entries clearly documented his participation in multiple murders. When confronted with the evidence, Dr. Carr initially attempted to maintain his innocence, claiming that the journal entries were elaborate fiction created by disturbed individuals. However, when faced with physical evidence linking him to the underground chamber and testimony from other community members, his resolve crumbled. Dr. Carr's confession provided crucial details about the psychological dynamics that had allowed the conspiracy to function for so long. He revealed that many participants had convinced themselves that they were not actually committing murder, but facilitating a spiritual transformation that allowed the victims to transcend ordinary physical existence. This elaborate self-deception had been essential to maintaining the group's cohesion and preventing members from developing guilt or remorse that might lead them to confess. Mrs. Margaret Thornton proved to be more resilient under questioning, maintaining for several days that the Historical Preservation Society had been devoted entirely to legitimate academic research. However, Henley's discovery of additional evidence in her cottage, including personal belongings from several of the murdered families, eventually forced her to acknowledge her role in the conspiracy. Mrs. Thornton's confession revealed the extent to which the murders had been integrated into the community's social and economic structure. The belongings of murdered families had been redistributed among conspiracy members. The victims' cottages had been rented or sold to provide income for the group's activities, and the disappearances had been used to eliminate families whose presence in the community was seen as disruptive or undesirable. Reverend Whitmore's arrest was the most dramatic and revealing of all. When Henley arrived at the rectory with a warrant, he found the vicar in his study, surrounded by documents that he was attempting to destroy. Whitmore had clearly been expecting arrest and had spent the previous days trying to eliminate evidence of his crimes. However, Whitmore's psychological state had deteriorated significantly since the Higgins murders. The journal entries had revealed growing paranoia and grandiose delusions in his final months, and by the time of his arrest, he was clearly suffering from a severe mental breakdown. His initial statements to Henley were rambling and incoherent, filled with references to divine commands and spiritual obligations that bore no relation to reality. The trial of the Ashworth conspirators, held at York Crown Court in the spring of 1966, attracted national attention and exposed details of the case that shocked even experienced observers of criminal behavior. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of systematic murder and community-wide complicity that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The prosecution's case was built around the journal entries, physical evidence from the underground chamber, and testimony from community members who had gradually been persuaded to break their silence. The scale of the conspiracy became clear as witness after witness acknowledged some level of knowledge about the murders, ranging from direct participation to willful ignorance of obvious warning signs. Dr. Carr's testimony was particularly damaging to the other defendants. His detailed account of the psychological manipulation techniques used by Father Blackwood and Reverend Whitmore revealed how educated, rational people had been gradually conditioned to participate in activities that they would normally find abhorrent. The process had been so gradual and carefully managed that many participants genuinely believed they were serving a noble purpose, even as they committed heinous crimes. The trial also revealed the economic motivations that had sustained the conspiracy alongside its pseudo-religious justifications. The murdered families had typically been property owners whose assets had been absorbed by the conspiracy members after their deaths. The pattern of victim selection had been influenced not just by spiritual considerations, but by practical factors such as property values and inheritance laws. Mrs. Thornton's testimony provided insight into the role that social pressure and community dynamics had played in maintaining the conspiracy. She described how dissent or questioning had been systematically discouraged through ostracism, economic pressure, and implied threats. Community members who expressed doubts about the disappearances had found themselves excluded from social activities, denied services, and subjected to rumors that damaged their reputations and livelihoods. Reverend Whitmore proved to be the most challenging defendant to prosecute due to his deteriorating mental state. Court-appointed psychiatrists determined that he was suffering from severe delusional disorders that may have been present for years before his crimes were discovered. However, the evidence clearly showed that his delusions had not prevented him from planning and executing complex criminal activities with considerable skill and forethought. As the trial progressed, the full scope of the Ashworth murders became clear. Forensic investigators working in the cave system beneath St. Mary's Church recovered the remains of 17 families, totaling 63 individuals, who had been murdered over a period of 35 years. The victims ranged in age from infant children to elderly grandparents, with entire family lines having been exterminated by the conspiracy. The forensic evidence revealed that the murders had been conducted using various methods, depending on the preferences of the leadership at different times. Father Blackwood had favored techniques that he claimed were based on ancient sacrificial practices, while Reverend Whitmore had developed more efficient methods that reduced the risk of detection and simplified disposal of the bodies. Many of the victims showed evidence of having been drugged before their deaths, supporting testimony about the use of substances to reduce resistance and make the murders easier to accomplish. The children's remains were particularly disturbing, showing signs of prolonged terror that suggested they had been aware of their fate before being killed. The investigation also revealed that the conspiracy had extended beyond Ashworth to include contacts in other Yorkshire communities. Several suspicious disappearances in neighbouring villages during the same period showed similar patterns, suggesting that the Ashworth group may have been part of a larger network of criminals operating under the cover of religious or historical research. The exposure of the Ashworth conspiracy had profound psychological effects on the surviving community members, many of whom had lived for decades with knowledge or suspicion of the murders without taking action to stop them. The trial testimony revealed the complex web of fear, complicity, and self-deception that had allowed the crimes to continue for so long. Many residents reported feelings of guilt and shame that persisted for years after the trials concluded. They struggled with questions about their own moral responsibility for failing to protect the victims, even when they had lacked specific knowledge of the crimes being committed. The revelation that respected community leaders had been systematic murderers destroyed many people's faith in their ability to judge character and trust authority figures. The psychological impact was particularly severe for children and young adults who had grown up in Ashworth during the period when the murders were being committed. Many reported feeling betrayed by adults they had trusted and respected, and some required extensive therapy to process their experiences. The knowledge that they had unknowingly lived alongside mass murderers for years created lasting trauma that affected their ability to form trusting relationships. Several community members developed symptoms consistent with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced recurring nightmares, anxiety attacks, and intrusive memories related to events they had witnessed or suspected during the conspiracy's active period. The peaceful rural environment that had once provided comfort became a source of constant reminders of the horror that had been hidden beneath the surface of village life. The Ashworth case also exposed significant failures in the institutional systems that should have protected the victims and prevented the conspiracy from operating for so long. The investigation revealed that various authorities had received reports about suspicious disappearances over the years, but had failed to conduct thorough investigations or connect the patterns that might have revealed the truth earlier. The Church of England's oversight of rural parishes proved to be inadequate for detecting and preventing the kind of criminal activity that had flourished under Father Blackwood and Reverend Whitmore. The hierarchical structure that gave parish clergy considerable autonomy had created opportunities for abuse that went undetected for decades. The investigation prompted significant reforms in church oversight procedures and background screening for clergy members. Local law enforcement had also failed to recognize the patterns that should have triggered more intensive investigation. The tendency to treat missing persons cases as voluntary departures, particularly in rural communities where people might reasonably choose to relocate for economic reasons, had allowed the conspirators to operate with impunity. The Ashworth case led to new protocols for investigating missing persons cases and improved coordination between different police jurisdictions. The medical and social services systems had similarly failed to protect potential victims or detect warning signs of abuse. Dr. Carr's dual role as both community physician and conspiracy member had allowed him to manipulate medical records and provide false documentation that supported the cover-up narratives. This revelation led to new requirements for independent medical verification in cases involving sudden family relocations or unexplained medical conditions. The legal proceedings against the Ashworth conspirators concluded in the autumn of 1966 with convictions for all the defendants who were mentally competent to stand trial. Reverend Whitmore was found guilty but mentally ill and was sentenced to indefinite confinement in a secure psychiatric facility. Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, and 4 other conspirators received life sentences for their roles in the murders. Several other community members received shorter sentences for their roles in the cover-ups and their failure to report knowledge of the crimes to authorities. The court recognized that many of these individuals had been subjected to psychological pressure and social coercion that had influenced their decisions, but maintained that adults had a fundamental responsibility to protect children and vulnerable people regardless of personal consequences. The sentences were controversial in some quarters, with critics arguing that they were either too lenient given the scope of the crimes or too harsh given the psychological manipulation that many defendants had experienced. However, the judge's statements during sentencing emphasized the importance of holding individuals accountable for their actions while acknowledging the complex social dynamics that had enabled the conspiracy to function. The financial assets of the convicted conspirators were seized and used to provide compensation to the families of victims who had relatives outside the Ashworth community. However, many of the murdered families had been deliberately selected because they lacked external connections, making it impossible to identify heirs or beneficiaries for compensation purposes. The exposure of the conspiracy and the subsequent trials effectively destroyed Ashworth as a functioning community. Most residents who were not directly implicated in the crimes chose to relocate rather than continue living in a place associated with such horror. Property values collapsed, businesses closed, and the village that had existed for centuries began to empty within months of the trial's conclusion. St. Mary's Church was officially deconsecrated by the Church of England and subsequently demolished to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid curiosity or inappropriate veneration. The underground chamber was sealed with concrete, and the entire area was covered with soil and planted with grass. However, local authorities found it impossible to completely erase the physical evidence of what had happened there. The cottages where the murdered families had lived were gradually abandoned as their associations with the crimes made them unmarketable. The Higgins cottage, where the investigation had begun, remained empty for years before finally being demolished in the early 1970s. The village school closed when enrollment dropped below sustainable levels, and the post office where Thomas Higgins had worked was shuttered permanently. By 1970, fewer than 50 people remained in what had once been a thriving community of 300. The remaining residents were mostly elderly individuals who lacked the resources to relocate, or younger people who had inherited property that they couldn't sell. The village that remained bore little resemblance to the close-knit community that had existed before the conspiracy's exposure. The physical infrastructure of Ashworth gradually deteriorated as maintenance became economically unfeasible. Roads developed potholes that weren't repaired, buildings fell into disrepair, and the carefully maintained gardens and public spaces became overgrown. The village that had once been a model of rural English community life became a ghost town that served as a permanent reminder of the horror that had flourished there. The Ashworth case had implications that extended far beyond the immediate community where the crimes had been committed. It became a subject of academic study for criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists who sought to understand how systematic murder could be maintained for decades within a small, seemingly normal community. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The revelation that ordinary people could be gradually conditioned to participate in mass murder forced experts to reconsider their understanding of how atrocities develop and persist. The Ashworth conspiracy demonstrated that evil could flourish not just under totalitarian regimes or in wartime conditions, but within peaceful democratic societies when the right psychological and social conditions were present. The religious aspects of the case prompted extensive discussion within various faith communities about the dangers of spiritual authority and the need for accountability in religious organizations. The fact that both perpetrators had been ordained clergy members who had used their positions to manipulate and murder their parishioners highlighted vulnerabilities in traditional religious structures that had previously received little attention. The case also contributed to growing awareness of the psychological techniques that could be used to manipulate individuals and groups. The detailed documentation of how normal, rational people had been gradually transformed into accomplices to murder provided valuable insights into the processes of radicalization and social control that would later inform research into cult behavior, terrorism, and other forms of extremist activity. This mystery shows us how easily communities can be deceived and corrupted by those who claim to act in the name of tradition or higher purpose. The Higgins family, like so many others before them, trusted their neighbors, their church, and their community leaders, never suspecting that beneath the surface of their quiet village lay a network of murder and deception that had been operating for decades. The most terrifying aspect of the Ashworth conspiracy was not the murders themselves, but the way that an entire community had been gradually conditioned to accept and participate in activities that would normally be recognized as obviously wrong. The process had been so gradual and carefully managed that many participants genuinely believed they were serving a noble purpose, even as they committed or enabled heinous crimes. The case demonstrates the importance of questioning authority, maintaining connections with the outside world, and refusing to accept explanations that don't make rational sense, no matter how prestigious or trusted their sources might be. It shows how isolation, both geographical and social, can create conditions where harmful ideas and practices can flourish without the scrutiny that might otherwise expose their true nature. Perhaps most importantly, the Ashworth case reminds us that the greatest horrors often come not from obvious monsters, but from the corruption of ordinary people who lose their way in the darkness of fanaticism, greed, and misplaced loyalty. The Higgins family's tragedy serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of surrendering critical thinking to charismatic leaders who claim to possess special knowledge or authority. What do you think of this story? Could something like this really happen in a small, close-knit community? Do you believe that ordinary people could be gradually manipulated into participating in such horrific crimes? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this chilling tale and want more dark mysteries like this, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that explore the darkest aspects of human nature. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters often hide behind the most respectable facades, and that our greatest protection against such evil is our willingness to ask difficult questions and refuse to accept comfortable lies.